The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete runway of Naval Air Station Oceana as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell stepped out of the transport aircraft. The Virginia heat hit her immediately, a stark contrast to the cool desert air she had left behind in Nevada just hours earlier. Her flight bag slung over one shoulder, she paused momentarily to survey her new home base, watching as FA-18 Super Hornets roared overhead in perfect formation. Sarah had been flying military aircraft for 8 years, but this assignment felt different. She was joining VFA, 143 Pukin Dogs, one of the Navy's most prestigious fighter squadrons, and she knew every eye would be on her. Not because she was new, but because she was one of only a handful of women to earn a spot in this elite unit. The transition from flying F-16s in the Air Force to Navy Super Hornets had been challenging enough, but the real test would be proving herself to a squadron full of seasoned naval aviators who had been flying together for years. As she made her way toward the squadron ready room, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Growing up in rural Montana, she had always been fascinated by aircraft. Her father, a crop duster pilot, had given her first flying lesson when she was 12 years old in his old Cessna. By 16, she had her private pilot's license, and by 18, she was accepted into the Air Force Academy. The path hadn't been easy. Flight school was grueling, and she had faced skepticism and sometimes outright hostility from instructors and fellow students who questioned whether women belonged in combat aircraft. But Sarah had persevered, driven by a burning desire to prove that skill and determination mattered more than gender. She had graduated at the top of her flight class and earned her wings as an F-16 pilot. Over the next 6 years, she had flown combat missions in Afghanistan and Syria, earning a reputation as one of the most skilled and fearless pilots in her squadron. Her call sign in the Air Force had been Phoenix, earned after she successfully landed a heavily damaged F-16 after taking enemy fire during a close air support mission in Afghanistan. The decision to transfer to the Navy had been difficult. She loved the Air Force, but the opportunity to fly the Navy's premier fighter aircraft and eventually qualify for carrier operations was too tempting to pass up. The inter-service transfer process had taken nearly 2 years, involving extensive paperwork, additional training, and political maneuvering at the highest levels of both services. There had been moments when Sarah wondered if it was worth the hassle, especially when some Navy officials questioned why they should accept an Air Force pilot when they had plenty of qualified naval aviators. The squadron ready room was buzzing with activity when Sarah entered. Pilots in green flight suits clustered around mission boards, studying approach plates and weather reports. The walls were covered with photographs of aircraft, squadron patches, and the names of pilots who had served with distinction. At the far end of the room, she could see a group of senior officers engaged in an animated discussion about the upcoming training exercise. "You must be Mitchell," said a voice behind her. Sarah turned to see a tall, sandy-haired lieutenant approaching with an extended hand. "I'm Dave Slider Johnson, one of the flight leads. Welcome to the Dogs." Sarah shook his hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. "Thanks. I'm looking forward to getting started." "I bet you are. We heard about your Air Force record. Pretty impressive stuff. Taking enemy fire and still completing the mission takes serious guts." Slider's tone was respectful, but Sarah detected a hint of reservation. Of course, carrier ops are a whole different animal than land-based flying. The boat doesn't forgive mistakes. Before Sarah could respond, a voice boomed across the ready room. "Attention on deck!" The room fell silent as everyone snapped to attention. Through the main entrance walked Rear Admiral Robert Thunderbolt Hayes, the Air Wing commander. At 55, Hayes was a legend in Navy aviation circles. He had flown combat missions in the Gulf War, Kosovo, and Iraq, earning the Navy Cross for heroism during a particularly harrowing mission over Baghdad in 2003. Admiral Hayes was known for his quick wit, sharp tongue, and intolerance for anything less than perfection. He had a reputation for testing new pilots with pointed questions and unexpected challenges. Stories of his intimidating presence were legendary throughout the fleet. Pilots spoke in hushed tones about his ability to spot weaknesses and exploit them during briefings and debriefings. As the Admiral made his way through the ready room greeting pilots and reviewing mission status boards, Sarah noticed that conversations stopped whenever he approached. The man commanded respect, through a combination of proven competence and an almost supernatural ability to read people. His piercing blue eyes seemed to take in everything at once, cataloging details that others might miss. "So, we have a new addition to the squadron," Admiral Hayes said as he approached Sarah's position near the coffee station. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, as every pilot within earshot turned to watch the interaction. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, isn't it? The Air Force transfer." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, standing at attention. "Thank you for approving my transfer request, Admiral." Hayes studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I didn't approve anything lightly, Mitchell. The Navy invested considerable resources in bringing you here, and I expect a return on that investment. Your Air Force record suggests you can handle yourself in combat. But this isn't the Air Force anymore. We do things differently here." "I understand, sir. I'm ready to learn and adapt to Navy procedures." "Good. Adaptation is key to survival in this business." The Admiral paused, then continued with what appeared to be casual curiosity. "I'm curious about something, though. Every pilot in my air wing has a call sign that means something. It tells a story about who they are or what they've done. Your Air Force call sign was Phoenix, I understand. But that was another service, another life. What should we call you here?" The question caught Sarah off guard. In the Air Force, call signs were usually assigned by squadron mates based on personality traits, memorable incidents, or sometimes embarrassing moments. She had assumed she would keep her Phoenix call sign or be assigned a new one by her new squadron mates over time. The Admiral's direct question put her on the spot in front of the entire ready room. "I hadn't really thought about it, sir," Sarah replied honestly. "I suppose that's something for the squadron to decide based on how I perform here." Admiral Hayes smiled, but it wasn't entirely friendly. "Oh, come now, Mitchell. Surely you must have some preference? Some idea of how you see yourself as a naval aviator? What kind of image do you want to project?" The room was completely silent now. Sarah could feel the weight of dozens of eyes watching her response. This felt like more than casual conversation. It felt like a test. The Admiral was probing for something, though she wasn't sure what. "With respect, sir, I'd rather earn whatever call sign the squadron thinks I deserve through my actions rather than suggest one myself." "Modest. I like that." Hayes nodded approvingly. "But humor me. If you could choose any call sign, anything at all, what would it be?" Sarah hesitated. The question felt loaded, like there was no right answer. If she chose something aggressive, she might be seen as trying too hard to prove herself. If she chose something too soft, she might be perceived as weak. The silence stretched on, becoming uncomfortable. "I suppose," she said finally, "something that reflects my approach to flying. Precise, focused, lethal when necessary." "Interesting," the Admiral mused. "And what would that be, exactly?" Sarah took a breath. She was committed now to giving a real answer. "Venom Viper, sir." The effect of her words was immediate and dramatic. The ready room, which had been merely quiet before, now felt like a vacuum. Several pilots exchanged glances, and she saw Slider's eyebrows shoot up in surprise. Admiral Hayes's expression changed completely, the casual demeanor replaced by something much more serious. "Did you say Venom Viper?" he asked slowly, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there moments before. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, suddenly wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. "Is there a problem with that call sign?" The Admiral stared at her for what felt like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Where did you hear that call sign, Lieutenant Commander?" "I didn't hear it anywhere, sir. I just thought of it now." Sarah could feel her heart rate increasing. Something was very wrong, but she had no idea what. Should I not have suggested it? Hayes continued to stare at her, his face pale. Around the room, she could see pilots looking confused and concerned. The atmosphere had shifted from casual curiosity to something approaching shock. "Admiral," Slider interjected carefully, "is everything all right?" Hayes seemed to snap back to the present. He looked around the room, noting the confused faces of his pilots, then back at Sarah. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, I need to speak with you privately. Everyone else, carry on with your normal duties." As the other pilots reluctantly returned to their activities, Sarah followed Admiral Hayes to a small office adjacent to the ready room. He closed the door behind them and motioned for her to take a seat. The office was spartanly decorated, with only a few personal photos on the desk and a collection of squadron patches on the wall. "Mitchell," Hayes began, settling into the chair behind his desk, "I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you ever heard the call sign Venom Viper before today?" "No, sir. I've never heard it used by anyone." Sarah was becoming increasingly worried. "Admiral, what's this about? Did I say something wrong?" Hayes was quiet for a long moment, seemingly wrestling with some internal decision. Finally, he opened his desk drawer and pulled out a faded photograph. He studied it for a moment before sliding it across the desk to Sarah. The photograph showed a young woman in a Navy flight suit standing next to an FA-18 Hornet. She was smiling confidently at the camera, her helmet tucked under one arm. Despite the age of the photo, Sarah could see that the woman bore a striking resemblance to herself. Same height, same build, similar facial features, even the same shade of blonde hair. "That photograph was taken 15 years ago," Hayes said quietly. "The pilot's name was Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Venom Viper Torres. She was one of the most skilled naval aviators I ever had the privilege of flying with." Sarah studied the photograph more closely. The resemblance was indeed remarkable, almost uncanny. "What happened to her, sir?" Hayes's expression grew even more somber. "She was killed in action over Afghanistan in 2009. Her FA-18 was hit by a surface-to-air missile during a close air support mission. She managed to destroy the enemy position that had been pinning down a Marine patrol before her aircraft went down. She saved the lives of 12 Marines that day." The room fell silent except for the distant sound of aircraft operations outside. Sarah continued to stare at the photograph, trying to process what she was hearing. The coincidence seemed impossible, almost supernatural. "Sir, I had no idea," she said finally. "I've never heard of Lieutenant Commander Torres or her call sign. The name just came to me when you asked." "I believe you," Hayes replied. "But you have to understand how unsettling this is. Rebecca Torres was not just any pilot. She was extraordinary. Her loss was felt throughout the entire Navy aviation community. And now, 15 years later, a pilot who looks remarkably like her walks into my squadron and spontaneously chooses her exact call sign." Sarah set the photograph down on the desk. "What does this mean, Admiral? Am I supposed to not use that call sign?" Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "I'm not sure what it means, Mitchell. What I do know is that Rebecca Torres earned that call sign through incredible skill and courage. If you're going to carry it, you need to understand the weight it carries." "I understand, sir. And if it would be more appropriate, I can choose something else." "No," Hayes said firmly. "I think perhaps this is meant to be. Rebecca would have wanted her legacy to live on through someone worthy of carrying it forward. The question is whether you're that person." Sarah met his gaze directly. "I'd like the chance to prove that I am, sir." The Admiral nodded slowly. "Very well, Venom Viper. But understand this. Every pilot in this air wing knew Rebecca Torres. They respected her, and many of them considered her a friend. You'll be carrying the expectations of everyone who served with her. That's a heavy burden." "I understand the responsibility, Admiral. I won't dishonor her memory." Hayes stood up from his desk and moved to the window overlooking the flight line. "Rebecca had a philosophy about flying," he said without turning around. "She believed that every mission was personal, not in an emotional sense, but in terms of responsibility. She felt that every time she strapped into that cockpit, she was carrying the hopes and trust of everyone who depended on her success. That's how I approach flying as well, sir. We'll see." He turned back to face her. "Your first training flight is scheduled for tomorrow morning. You'll be flying with Lieutenant Commander Razor Martinez. He was Rebecca's wingman for 2 years. He'll be evaluating your skills and reporting back to me." Sarah stood up as well. "I'll be ready, sir." As she reached for the door handle, Admiral Hayes called her name. "Venom Viper?" She turned back to face him. "Don't try to be Rebecca Torres. Be the best version of Sarah Mitchell that you can be." That's what she would have wanted. "Yes, sir." As Sarah left the Admiral's office and returned to the ready room, she could feel the weight of curious stares from her new squadron mates. Word of her chosen call sign had clearly spread, and she could see a mixture of surprise, curiosity, and what might have been skepticism in their faces. She knew that the coming days would be crucial in establishing her place within the squadron, and proving that she was worthy of carrying such a significant name. The rest of the day passed in a blur of administrative tasks, aircraft familiarization, and informal meetings with her new colleagues. Each interaction felt charged with the knowledge of her call sign choice and its connection to the squadron's past. Some pilots were openly curious about how she had chosen the name, while others seemed to maintain a respectful distance, perhaps waiting to see how she would perform before passing judgment. As evening approached and the flight line grew quiet, Sarah found herself standing alone next to one of the squadron's FA-18 Super Hornets. The aircraft was imposing in the fading light, its gray paint scheme and weapons pylons a reminder of the serious nature of her chosen profession. Tomorrow she would climb into the cockpit of a similar aircraft and begin the process of proving herself to a new squadron, a new service, and the memory of a pilot she had never met but whose legacy she now carried. The weight of expectation was enormous, but Sarah felt ready for the challenge. She had overcome obstacles before, and she was confident in her abilities as a pilot and an officer. As she walked back toward the squadron spaces, she made a silent promise to Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Torres and to herself. She would honor the name Venom Viper through her actions, her professionalism, and her dedication to the mission. The real test would begin tomorrow. Dawn broke gray and overcast over Naval Air Station Oceana, with low clouds hanging like a ceiling over the flight line. Sarah arrived at the squadron ready room at 0500, 2 hours before her scheduled briefing time. Sleep had been elusive the previous night, her mind racing with thoughts about the day ahead and the weight of expectations that came with her chosen call sign. The ready room was nearly empty at this early hour, occupied only by a duty officer updating weather boards and a maintenance chief reviewing aircraft status reports. Sarah used the quiet time to study the FA-18 Super Hornet flight manual and review the planned training mission. Though she had completed the formal transition training from F-16s to Super Hornets, she knew that each squadron had its own procedures and standards. Lieutenant Commander Eduardo Razor Martinez arrived precisely at 0630, carrying a well-worn flight bag and a large cup of coffee. At 34, he was a seasoned naval aviator with over 2,000 flight hours in the Super Hornet and 3 combat deployments. His call sign had been earned during his first deployment, when his aggressive flying style and precision in air-to-air combat had impressed his squadron mates. More relevantly for today's mission, he had been Rebecca Torres's wingman during her final deployment. "Morning, Venom," Razor said, using her call sign for the first time. The name sounded strange in his voice, carrying echoes of conversations from years past. "Ready for your Navy debut?" "Ready as I'll ever be," Sarah replied. "I appreciate you taking the time to fly with me today." Razor studied her for a moment, his expression serious. "Before we get started, I want to be clear about something. I knew Rebecca Torres well. We flew together for 2 years, and she was one of the finest pilots I ever worked with. When Admiral Hayes told me about your call sign choice yesterday, it brought back a lot of memories." Sarah nodded, understanding the delicate position she was in. "I hope you know that I chose that name without any knowledge of Lieutenant Commander Torres. I would never intentionally appropriate someone else's legacy." "I believe you," Razor said. "But here's the thing. Rebecca earned that call sign by being the most aggressive and precise pilot in our squadron. She had an ability to find and exploit enemy weaknesses that was almost supernatural. If you're going to carry her name, you need to understand what it represents. I'm ready to prove myself worthy of it. We'll see." Razor moved to the mission planning table and spread out charts and briefing materials. "Today's flight is designed to evaluate your basic airmanship and tactical awareness. We'll start with some formation flying to see how you handle the Super Hornet in close proximity to other aircraft. Then we'll move on to some basic fighter maneuvers and see how you think tactically." The briefing lasted an hour, covering weather conditions, emergency procedures, communication frequencies, and mission objectives. Razor was thorough and professional, but Sarah could sense that he was evaluating her responses and questions, looking for signs of competence or weakness. Every detail mattered when flying high-performance military aircraft, and any gaps in knowledge or preparation could be fatal. As they walked toward the flight line, Razor continued the conversation that had started in the ready room. Rebecca had a philosophy about flying that she shared with me once. She said that every time you strap into a fighter aircraft, you're not just representing yourself, you're representing every pilot who came before you and every pilot who will come after you. The standards you set become the standards others will try to meet. Sarah absorbed this wisdom as she conducted her pre-flight inspection of the Super Hornet. The aircraft was magnificent, a testament to decades of technological advancement and engineering excellence. The twin engines could generate over 22,000 pounds of thrust each, propelling the aircraft to speeds exceeding Mach 1.8. The advanced radar and weapon systems made it one of the most capable fighter aircraft in the world. The pre-flight inspection was a ritual that every pilot took seriously. Sarah methodically checked every system, looking for signs of damage, wear, or malfunction. The lives of aircrew and the success of missions depended on the mechanical reliability of these complex machines. Any shortcut or oversight during the inspection process could have catastrophic consequences. "Your inspection technique is solid," Razor observed, as he completed his own pre-flight checks on the adjacent aircraft. "I can see your Air Force training. You're being thorough without wasting time." "My first flight instructor taught me that the pre-flight inspection is where you start building confidence for the mission," Sarah replied. "If you know your aircraft is in perfect condition, you can focus entirely on flying and fighting." 20 minutes later, both pilots were strapped into their cockpits, running through engine start procedures and systems checks. The Super Hornet's cockpit was a marvel of modern technology, with multifunction displays providing real-time information about aircraft systems, navigation, and tactical situations. Compared to the F-16 cockpit Sarah was accustomed to, the Super Hornet offered more information and automation, but also required more complex management procedures. "Oceana Tower, Navy 201 Flight of 2, ready for taxi," Razor transmitted over the radio. "Navy 201 Flight, taxi to runway 05 right, wind 070 at 8 knots. As they taxied toward the runway, Sarah marveled at the feeling of power beneath her. The Super Hornet was heavier than the F-16 but felt more stable and solid. The twin engines provided tremendous acceleration potential, and the aircraft's larger size gave it the capability to carry more fuel and weapons than her previous mount. "Navy 201, you are cleared for takeoff." Razor released his brakes and began his takeoff roll. Sarah followed 30 seconds later, smoothly advancing the throttles and feeling the Super Hornet accelerate down the runway. At 150 knots, she pulled back gently on the stick and felt the aircraft lift gracefully into the gray Virginia morning. The first hour of the flight focused on basic formation procedures. Sarah demonstrated her ability to maintain precise position relative to Razor's aircraft through various maneuvers and configuration changes. Formation flying required constant attention and smooth control inputs, as any sudden or excessive movement could result in a collision. "Your formation work is excellent," Razor's voice crackled through her helmet radio. "You're anticipating my movements and maintaining proper spacing. Ready to move on to some tactical maneuvering?" "Ready when you are, lead." What followed was an intensive evaluation of Sarah's fighter pilot skills. Razor put her through a series of increasingly complex scenarios, testing her ability to maintain situational awareness while maneuvering aggressively in 3 dimensions. The exercises included defensive maneuvering against simulated missile attacks, offensive positioning for weapons employment, and energy management during extended engagements. Sarah found herself pushing the Super Hornet to its limits, pulling over 7 Gs in tight turns while simultaneously managing radar contacts and communication with her wingman. The physical demands were intense, but her years of experience flying high-performance aircraft had prepared her for the physiological challenges of combat maneuvering. "Venom, you have a bandit at your 6 o'clock, closing fast," Razor called over the radio, initiating a simulated air-to-air engagement. "Recommend you turn left and notch the threat." Sarah immediately rolled into a hard left turn, pulling the aircraft's nose toward the horizon while monitoring her radar warning receiver for indications of incoming missiles. The simulated engagement required her to balance offensive and defensive considerations while maintaining awareness of her wingman's position and the overall tactical situation. For the next 20 minutes, the two Super Hornets twisted and turned through the sky in a complex aerial chess match. Sarah demonstrated her ability to think tactically while flying aggressively, always looking for opportunities to gain advantage while avoiding exposing herself to counterattack. Her Air Force training had emphasized individual combat skills, but Navy tactics required closer coordination between wingmen. "Knock it off," Razor finally called, terminating the training engagement. "Let's head back to the ship for some pattern work." The return to base gave Sarah an opportunity to demonstrate her airfield approach and landing skills. The Super Hornet's approach speed was higher than what she was accustomed to in the F-16, and the twin-engine configuration required different energy management techniques. However, her landing was smooth and precise, touching down exactly on the designated spot with perfect alignment. As they taxied back to the squadron parking area, Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction about her performance. The flight had been challenging, but she had handled every task competently and professionally. More importantly, she had begun to develop a feel for the Super Hornet's unique flying characteristics and capabilities. The post-flight debriefing took place in a small conference room adjacent to the ready room. Razor had taken detailed notes during the flight and was prepared to provide comprehensive feedback on every aspect of Sarah's performance. These debriefings were critical learning opportunities, where mistakes could be identified and corrected before they became dangerous habits. "Overall, your flying skills are impressive," Razor began. "You clearly have extensive experience in high-performance aircraft, and your transition to the Super Hornet is progressing well. Your formation work was excellent, and your tactical awareness during the air-to-air exercises showed good instincts." Sarah listened carefully to the feedback, taking notes and asking questions when clarification was needed. Razor was thorough but fair in his assessment, noting both strengths and areas that needed improvement. "There are a few things we need to work on," he continued. "Your energy management during the defensive maneuvering could be more efficient. You were bleeding airspeed faster than necessary in some of the turns. Also, your communication during the tactical exercises needs to be more precise. In Navy flying, brevity and clarity are essential." Sarah nodded, accepting the constructive criticism. "I appreciate the feedback. I know there's a learning curve in adapting to Navy procedures." "That's expected," Razor replied. "The important thing is that you're coachable and willing to adapt. That's what I'll be telling Admiral Hayes." As the debriefing concluded, Razor's demeanor became more personal. "I have to admit, when I first heard about your call sign choice, I was skeptical. Rebecca Torres was special, and the idea of someone else using her call sign felt wrong. But after flying with you today, I think I understand why it happened." "What do you mean?" Razor leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "Rebecca had a presence in the cockpit that was hard to define. She was aggressive when she needed to be, but never reckless. She was confident without being arrogant. Watching you fly today, I saw some of those same qualities. You have good instincts and solid skills, but more importantly, you have the right attitude." Sarah felt a mix of pride and responsibility at his words. "Thank you. That means a lot coming from someone who knew her. Don't get me wrong," Razor continued. "You're not Rebecca Torres, and you shouldn't try to be. But I think you have the potential to honor her legacy in your own way. The question is whether you're willing to put in the work to reach that level." "I am," Sarah replied without hesitation. "What do I need to do?" Razor smiled for the first time since they had met. "Keep flying like you did today, but push yourself to be better. Rebecca never settled for good enough. She was always looking for ways to improve, always studying tactics and techniques. She read everything she could get her hands on about air combat and spent hours analyzing gun camera footage from training flights. I can do that. I believe you can. And there's one more thing." Razor reached into his flight bag and pulled out a worn notebook. This belonged to Rebecca. It's her personal notes on tactics, techniques, and lessons learned from her flights. "Admiral Hayes asked me to decide whether you were ready to have it." Sarah accepted the notebook with reverence, understanding the significance of the gesture. "Are you sure? This seems too personal to share." "Rebecca would have wanted it to be used by someone who could benefit from it," Razor replied. "She was always eager to share her knowledge with younger pilots. Consider it a loan. Study it, learn from it, but remember that the real value is in understanding her thought processes. not memorizing her specific techniques. As Sarah flipped through the notebook, she could see Rebecca's handwriting filling page after page with detailed observations about flying and fighting. The notes covered everything from basic aircraft handling to complex tactical scenarios, showing a mind that was constantly analyzing and seeking improvement. This is incredible. Thank you for trusting me with it. Don't thank me yet, Razor warned. Thank me when you've proven yourself worthy of carrying her call sign in combat. That's when the real test comes. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several other squadron pilots, including Slider and two lieutenant commanders Sarah hadn't met before. Word of her training flight had apparently spread through the squadron, and there was obvious curiosity about how she had performed. "So how did our new Venom Viper do?" asked Lieutenant Commander Spike Wilson, a tall redhead with an easy smile. "Did she embarrass herself or impress us?" Razor looked at Sarah before responding. "She held her own. Good airmanship. Solid tactical instincts. She'll do fine once she gets fully up to speed on Navy procedures." The response was non-committal enough to avoid creating unrealistic expectations while still indicating that Sarah had met the minimum standards. She appreciated Razor's diplomatic approach, understanding that she would have many more opportunities to prove herself to the squadron. "What about the call sign situation?" Slider asked. "That must have been weird, flying with someone using Rebecca's name." "It was interesting," Razor admitted. "But I think Rebecca would have approved. She always said that the best way to honor fallen aviators was to maintain the highest possible standards in their memory." The group conversation continued for another hour, with Sarah gradually being integrated into the squadron's informal social structure. She listened more than she spoke, learning about personalities, relationships, and the unwritten rules that governed squadron life. Every military unit had its own culture, and understanding that culture was essential for success. As the day shift ended and pilots began heading home, Admiral Hayes appeared in the ready room doorway. "Venom Viper, could I see you for a moment?" Sarah followed him back to his office, wondering what assessment Razor had provided during his private debrief with the Admiral. "Sit down, Lieutenant Commander," Hayes said, settling behind his desk. "I just finished talking with Razor about your flight today. He was complimentary about your skills and attitude." "Thank you, sir." "Lieutenant Commander Martinez is an excellent instructor. He's also an honest evaluator," Hayes continued. "When he tells me that a pilot has potential, I listen. He seems to think you might be worthy of the call sign you've chosen." Sarah felt a surge of relief and satisfaction. "I hope to prove him right, Admiral." "So do I." Hayes opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. "This belonged to Rebecca Torres. Her parents asked me to give it to someone who could carry on her legacy appropriately." Inside the box was a small silver pin in the shape of a viper, with tiny emeralds for eyes. It was clearly a personal item, something that held deep meaning for the woman who had worn it. "She had this pin made after she earned her call sign," Hayes explained. "She wore it on every flight. Her parents wanted it to continue flying with someone who understood its significance." Sarah accepted the pin with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the trust being placed in her. "Sir, I don't know if I'm ready for this responsibility." "None of us ever feel ready for the responsibilities we're given," Hayes replied. "But leadership and legacy aren't about feeling ready. They're about rising to meet the expectations placed on us, even when we're not sure we can." As Sarah left Admiral Hayes' office that evening, she felt the weight of history and expectation settling on her shoulders. The flight pin was now attached to her flight suit, and Rebecca Torres's notebook was tucked safely in her flight bag. She had taken the first steps toward proving herself worthy of the Venom Viper call sign, but she knew the real challenges lay ahead. The transformation from Air Force pilot to Navy aviator was about more than just learning new procedures and aircraft. It was about understanding and embracing a different culture, different standards, and different expectations. Most importantly, it was about honoring the memory of a fallen warrior while forging her own path forward. That night, Sarah spent hours reading through Rebecca's notebook, studying the tactical insights and philosophical observations that had shaped one of the Navy's finest fighter pilots. Each page revealed new layers of understanding about air combat and the mental approach required for success. It was clear that Rebecca Torres had been not just a skilled pilot, but a true student of warfare. As she finally closed the notebook and prepared for sleep, Sarah made a silent promise to the memory of the woman whose legacy she now carried. She would honor the Venom Viper name through her actions, her dedication, and her commitment to the highest standards of naval aviation. The real test was yet to come, but she felt ready to face whatever challenges awaited her. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's arrival at VFAE 143, and the routine of squadron life had begun to feel familiar. Daily flight training, mission planning sessions, and endless briefings had consumed most of her time, leaving little opportunity for doubt or second-guessing. Her performance had been consistently solid, earning grudging respect from her squadron mates and cautious approval from the leadership. The real test came on a humid Thursday morning when Admiral Hayes called an urgent squadron meeting. Sarah arrived at the ready room to find unusual activity levels, with intelligence officers setting up briefing boards and communications personnel checking secure phone lines. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the electricity that preceded operational deployments. "Listen up, everyone," Admiral Hayes announced as the last pilots filed into the room. "We've received orders for an immediate deployment to the USS Gerald R. Ford. The ship is currently operating in the eastern Mediterranean, and we're needed to augment their air wing for a developing situation." Sarah felt her heart rate increase. This would be her first operational deployment with the Navy, and her first time aboard an aircraft carrier. All her training and preparation had been leading to this moment, but she still felt a surge of nervous anticipation. "The political situation in the region has deteriorated rapidly," continued Commander Sarah Boss Jackson, the squadron commander who had just returned from a classified briefing. "Intelligence indicates that hostile forces are threatening shipping lanes and preparing to attack civilian targets. Our mission will be to provide air superiority and close air support as required." The briefing continued for 2 hours, covering everything from rules of engagement to weather patterns in the deployment area. Sarah took detailed notes, aware that every piece of information could prove critical during actual combat operations. The stakes were infinitely higher than training flights over Virginia. "Deployment begins tomorrow at 0600, Admiral Hayes concluded. "All personnel and equipment will be transported by C-130 to Norfolk Naval Base, where we'll board the Ford Speed." Questions. Lieutenant Commander Martinez raised his hand. "Admiral, what's the expected duration of this deployment?" "Unknown at this time," Hayes replied. "Could be weeks, could be months. Depends on how the situation develops. Pack accordingly." As the briefing ended and pilots began filing out to prepare for departure, Admiral Hayes called Sarah aside. "Venom Viper," a word. They moved to his office, where Hayes closed the door and activated a white noise generator to prevent eavesdropping. "This deployment represents your introduction to real Navy operations," he said. "Everything you've done so far has been preparation for this moment." "I understand, sir. I'm ready. Are you?" Hayes's question carried weight beyond its simple words. Combat operations aboard an aircraft carrier are unlike anything you've experienced in the Air Force. The margin for error is essentially zero, and the consequences of mistakes are severe. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Sir, I've flown combat missions before. I understand the responsibilities. Land-based combat missions," Hayes corrected. "Carrier operations add layers of complexity that can overwhelm even experienced pilots. You'll be landing on a moving deck in the middle of the ocean, often in challenging weather conditions, sometimes with battle damage or low fuel. There's no alternate airfield to divert to if things go wrong." The Admiral moved to his window, looking out at the flight line where maintenance crews were already preparing aircraft for the upcoming deployment. Rebecca Torres made her first carrier deployment as a lieutenant with only 200 hours in the Super Hornet. She was nervous, like any pilot would be, but she had natural instincts that made her exceptional. What kind of instincts? Hayes turned back to face her. The ability to remain calm under extreme pressure. The willingness to make split-second decisions with incomplete information. Most importantly, the capacity to learn from every experience, good or bad. He returned to his desk and opened a secure file folder. "I'm going to share something with you that isn't in Rebecca's official record. During her first combat deployment, she made a mistake that nearly cost the lives of several Marines on the ground. Sarah listened intently as Hayes described an incident where Rebecca had misidentified a target during a close air support mission, nearly engaging friendly forces before being corrected by her wingman at the last second. The error had been due to communication problems and poor visibility, but it had shaken her confidence badly. "The point of that story," Hayes said, "is that even exceptional pilots make mistakes. What separates good pilots from great ones is how they respond to those mistakes." Rebecca used that incident as a learning experience that made her a better pilot and a more effective combat aviator. "I appreciate you sharing that, sir. It helps me understand what I might face out there." "Good, because this deployment isn't just about your technical skills as a pilot. It's about proving that you can carry the Venom Viper call sign with honor under real operational conditions." The next 24 hours passed in a blur of packing, equipment checks, and final preparations. Sarah's personal gear fit into 2 bags, everything she would need for an indefinite deployment compressed into the absolute minimum. Military life had taught her to travel light and prioritize functionality over comfort. The C-130 transport flight to Norfolk Naval Base was cramped and noisy, with 24 pilots and support personnel squeezed into the cargo compartment along with essential equipment and spare parts. Sarah found herself sitting next to Lieutenant Cowboy Anderson, a young pilot on his second deployment, who seemed eager to share his experiences. "Your first time on a carrier?" Cowboy asked during a brief lull in the engine noise. "Yes. Any advice?" Cowboy grinned. "Don't look down when you're coming in for your first trap. The deck looks impossibly small from the air, and if you think too hard about what you're trying to do, you'll psych yourself out. What else? Eat everything they put in front of you, even if you're not hungry. Carrier food isn't great, but you never know when you'll get another meal. And make friends with the ship's company. They're the ones who keep everything running, and they can make your deployment much easier if they like you." The conversation continued as the transport aircraft droned eastward over the Atlantic. Sarah absorbed every piece of practical wisdom, understanding that the informal knowledge passed between pilots was often as valuable as formal training. The USS Gerald R. Ford was an impressive sight as their aircraft approached for landing. At over 1,100 feet long and displacing nearly 100,000 tons, the nuclear-powered supercarrier was one of the most complex machines ever built by humans. Its flight deck was bustling with activity as aircraft landed and launched in a carefully choreographed ballet of organized chaos. Sarah's first carrier landing as a passenger gave her a preview of what she would soon be attempting as a pilot. The C-130's touchdown on the carrier deck was firm but controlled, followed immediately by the sensation of rapid deceleration as the aircraft's tailhook engaged one of the ship's arresting cables. "Welcome to the Ford," announced the aircrew chief as the engine spooled down. "Keep your gear together and follow the escort to your berthing areas." The next several hours were consumed with check-in procedures, safety briefings, and orientation tours of the ship. Sarah's stateroom was tiny but functional, shared with Lieutenant Commander Torch Williams, a pilot from another squadron who had been flying off carriers for 6 years. "The most important thing to remember," Torch explained as they stowed their gear, "is that everything on this ship serves the mission of launching and recovering aircraft. Every person, every system, every procedure is designed around that core function. If you interfere with flight operations, even accidentally, you'll make a lot of enemies very quickly." Sarah's first opportunity to observe actual carrier flight operations came that evening during the recovery of a training mission. She stood on the observation deck behind the ship's island superstructure, watching as FA-18 Super Hornets approached the carrier at 150 miles per hour and caught arresting cables with their tailhooks. "It never gets old," said a voice behind her. Sarah turned to see Admiral Hayes approaching, wearing a khaki uniform and a serious expression. Watching pilots thread that needle night after night is one of the most impressive displays of skill and courage you'll ever see. "It looks terrifying," Sarah admitted. "Much more challenging than landing on a stationary runway. It is, but it's also what separates Navy pilots from everyone else. Anyone can land on a 10,000-foot runway. It takes something special to consistently hit a moving target that's only 500 feet long." They watched in silence as another Super Hornet approached, its hook catching the number 3 wire and pulling the aircraft to a stop in less than 300 feet. The precision and timing required were extraordinary, demanding split-second decision-making and absolute confidence in one's abilities. Your first carrier qualification flights begin tomorrow morning, Admiral Hayes said. Lieutenant Commander Martinez will be your instructor pilot, and you'll be flying with some of the most experienced carrier aviators in the Navy. Are you ready? As ready as I'll ever be, sir. Good. Because tomorrow you'll find out whether you truly deserve to carry Rebecca Torres's call sign. Sarah spent that night studying carrier landing procedures and emergency protocols, preparing for what she knew would be the most challenging flying of her career. Rebecca's notebook had several pages devoted to carrier operations, with detailed observations about approach angles, power settings, and mental preparation techniques. One entry particularly caught her attention. Carrier landings are 90% mental preparation and 10% physical execution. If you can visualize the perfect approach in your mind, your hands and feet will follow automatically. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and never give up on the pass until the hook is down and the engines are shut down. The next morning dawned clear and calm, ideal conditions for carrier qualification flights. Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection with extra care, knowing that any mechanical problem could complicate an already challenging mission. The Super Hornet looked magnificent in the early morning light, its gray paint scheme blending perfectly with the steel deck of the carrier. Today we're going to start with some basic pattern work, Martinez explained during their briefing. We'll shoot several approaches to get you comfortable with the sight picture and timing. Then we'll move on to actual arrested landings. The key is to fly a stabilized approach, and trust the landing signal officers to guide you safely aboard. The first flight of the day took them away from the carrier to practice approaches on a simulated deck painted on the ocean surface. Sarah found the experience disorienting at first, as the absence of familiar visual references made it difficult to judge altitude and airspeed accurately. "You're flying too flat an approach," Martinez's voice crackled through her helmet radio. "Steepen it up and add a little power." Sarah adjusted her flight path and throttle settings, gradually developing a feel for the unique requirements of carrier approaches. The angle was much steeper than land-based landings, and the power-on approach technique required constant throttle adjustments to maintain the proper descent rate. After an hour of practice approaches, they returned to the carrier for Sarah's first actual trap attempt. The Ford looked impossibly small from 3 miles out, a distant speck on the vast blue expanse of the Mediterranean. As they entered the carrier's landing pattern, Sarah could see other aircraft in various stages of approach and recovery. "Call the ball when you acquire the optical landing system," Martinez instructed. "The LSOs will guide you from there." Sarah spotted the Fresnel lens optical landing system known as the Meatball, which provided visual guidance for the final approach. The orange ball of light indicated her position relative to the ideal glide path, and she made constant adjustments to keep it centered. "Super Hornet Ball 3.2, she transmitted to the landing signal officers, indicating her aircraft type and fuel remaining. "Roger Ball," came the response from the LSO platform. "Looking good on glide path." The next 60 seconds felt like an eternity as Sarah flew down the glide path toward the carrier deck. The ship grew larger with each second, but the deck still looked impossibly narrow for a successful landing. Her airspeed was exactly 145 knots, her angle of attack properly set, and her hook was down and ready to catch one of the ship's 4 arresting cables. "A little power," called the LSO. "You're settling below glide path." Sarah added a touch of throttle, feeling the Super Hornet respond immediately. The deck was rushing up now, and she could see sailors in colored jerseys positioned around the landing area. Everything depended on the next few seconds. The main landing gear touched the deck with a solid thump, followed immediately by the nose gear. Sarah felt the reassuring tug of the arresting cable catching her tailhook, and the aircraft decelerated rapidly from 145 knots to 0 in less than 2 seconds. "Welcome aboard," called the yellow-shirted taxi director, guiding her out of the landing area to make room for the next aircraft. Sarah felt a surge of elation as she taxied to the parking area. She had successfully completed her first carrier landing, a milestone that marked her true entry into the elite community of naval aviators. The sense of accomplishment was overwhelming, but she knew this was only the beginning. The subsequent flights that day went progressively better as Sarah gained confidence and experience with carrier operations. Each landing built on the previous one, refining her technique and improving her ability to make the tiny corrections necessary for consistently safe recoveries. "Your progress today was excellent," Martinez told her during their debrief that evening. "You've adapted to carrier operations faster than most pilots. Your Air Force background actually helped in some ways, because you already had the fundamental flying skills. You just needed to learn the Navy's way of doing things." "Thank you, sir. I feel like I'm starting to understand what makes carrier aviation so challenging." "You're just scratching the surface," Martinez warned. "Wait until you try landing at night in rough weather with low fuel and battle damage. That's when you'll really understand what this job demands." That evening, Sarah stood on the carrier's flight deck watching the sunset paint the Mediterranean sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The ship was heading east toward the crisis zone, where real combat operations awaited. She thought about Rebecca Torres and the challenges the young pilot must have faced during her first deployment. The Venom Viper pin was still attached to her flight suit, and Rebecca's notebook remained in her stateroom, both serving as constant reminders of the legacy she had chosen to carry forward. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and perhaps her first taste of actual combat. But tonight she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction at having successfully taken the first crucial steps toward proving herself worthy of her chosen call sign. The carrier's wake stretched behind them like a white arrow pointing toward home, but home was thousands of miles away. For the foreseeable future, this floating city of steel and determination would be her world, and these men and women, her family. The real test of her worthiness to carry the Venom Viper name was about to begin. As she prepared for sleep that night, Sarah reflected on the events of the day and the challenges that lay ahead. Carrier qualification had been just the first hurdle. Soon she would be flying combat missions over hostile territory, where mistakes could cost lives and success depended on split-second decisions made under extreme pressure. But for tonight, she was content to be Lieutenant Commander Sarah Venom Viper Mitchell, naval aviator, serving aboard one of the most powerful warships ever built. The journey from Air Force pilot to Navy fighter pilot was nearly complete, but the most important chapters of her story were yet to be written. The urgent klaxon of general quarters pierced the pre-dawn darkness aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford, jolting Sarah from her sleep. Red lights bathed the passageways as sailors rushed to their battle stations, and the ship's announcement system crackled with the voice of the commanding officer. "This is not a drill. All hands to battle stations. Air Wing personnel report to ready rooms immediately for emergency briefing." Sarah dressed quickly in her flight suit and made her way through the maze of corridors to the VFA 143 ready room. The urgency was palpable as pilots and support personnel filled the space, some still rubbing sleep from their eyes. Admiral Hayes stood at the front of the room beside a large tactical display showing the Eastern Mediterranean. 40 minutes ago, Hayes began without preamble. Hostile forces launched a coordinated attack on a civilian merchant convoy approximately 200 miles northeast of our position. 3 cargo ships and an oil tanker are under attack by fast attack craft and shore-based aircraft. We have been ordered to provide immediate assistance. The display showed red symbols indicating enemy positions and blue symbols representing friendly forces. Sarah studied the tactical situation, noting the complexity of the operational environment and the proximity of hostile shore-based threats. Intelligence indicates that the attacking forces are equipped with modern anti-ship missiles and surface-to-air weapons, continued Commander Jackson. This is not a training exercise. These people are shooting real missiles with real warheads, and they have already demonstrated their willingness to target civilian vessels. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as the reality of her first combat mission sank in. All her training, all her preparation had been leading to this moment. The theoretical suddenly became deadly real. "Flight assignments are posted on the duty board," Admiral Hayes announced. "Launch sequence begins in 90 minutes. Pilots, study your mission packets carefully. This is what we've trained for." Sarah found her name assigned to a 2-plane section with Lieutenant Commander Martinez as flight lead. Their mission was combat air patrol over the threatened convoy, with secondary tasking for close air support if ground forces became involved. The complexity of the operation required careful coordination between multiple aircraft, ships, and intelligence sources. As she studied the mission materials, Sarah noticed that several of the other pilots were watching her carefully. This would be her first test under actual combat conditions, and everyone wanted to see how the new pilot with the legendary call sign would perform when lives were on the line. "Nervous?" asked Cowboy Anderson, settling into the seat beside her. "Focused," Sarah replied honestly. "This is what I signed up for." Good attitude. Rebecca Torres said something similar before her first combat mission. She told me once that the key was to channel nervous energy into tactical awareness rather than letting it become fear. The briefing lasted 2 hours, covering everything from weather conditions to rules of engagement. The enemy forces were well equipped and had shown tactical sophistication in their attacks on the merchant ships. Intelligence suggested they might have shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles, which posed a significant threat to low-flying aircraft. "Remember," Admiral Hayes concluded, "our primary mission is to protect those civilian sailors. They're counting on us to get them home safely to their families. Every decision you make up there should be evaluated against that standard." As the briefing ended, Martinez approached Sarah with a serious expression. "Ready for this, Venom?" "As ready as I'll ever be." "Good. Just remember everything we've practiced. Fly the aircraft first, maintain situational awareness, and communicate constantly. In combat, the pilot who has the best picture of what's happening usually wins." The flight deck was a scene of controlled chaos as aircraft were spotted for launch. Sarah's Super Hornet was loaded with AIM-120 MRAM air-to-air missiles. AIM. 9 Sidewinder heat-seeking missiles, and a 20 cannon with 500 rounds. The weapons represented the most advanced air-to-air combat systems in the world, but their effectiveness would depend entirely on the skill of the pilot employing them. Pre-flight inspection took on new significance knowing that combat was imminent. Sarah checked every system twice, looking for any sign of malfunction that could compromise the mission. The maintainers had done their job perfectly, but the final responsibility for flight safety rested with the pilot. "You're looking at everything pretty carefully," observed Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, the plane captain responsible for Sarah's aircraft. "I want to be absolutely sure everything is perfect," Sarah replied. "This isn't a training flight." "No, ma'am, it sure isn't. But this bird is ready for whatever you need her to do. I've been working on Super Hornets for 12 years, and this is one of the best maintained aircraft in the squadron." The chief's confidence was reassuring, but Sarah knew that even perfectly maintained aircraft could suffer unexpected failures. Combat flying pushed machines and pilots to their absolute limits, often revealing weaknesses that never appeared during routine operations. "Launch sequence commencing," announced the airboss over the flight deck speakers. "All personnel not essential to flight operations clear the deck immediately." Sarah climbed into her cockpit and began the engine start checklist, each item committed to memory through countless hours of practice. The twin F414 engines spooled up smoothly, their distinctive whine adding to the symphony of sounds on the busy flight deck. "Navy 201 cleared to taxi," came the call from the air traffic controller. Sarah followed Martinez's aircraft to the catapult, where yellow-shirted personnel attached the launch bridle and made final preparations for launch. The catapult shot would accelerate her aircraft from 0 to 165 miles per hour in less than 3 seconds, a violent but necessary process for getting heavily loaded fighters airborne from a carrier deck. "Navy 201, you are cleared for launch," transmitted the catapult officer. Sarah advanced her throttles to military power, felt the engines reach their proper settings, then saluted the catapult officer to indicate her readiness. The shot came as a tremendous kick in the back, pressing her deep into her ejection seat, as the Super Hornet accelerated down the catapult track. In 3 seconds, she was airborne, climbing away from the carrier at 200 knots and feeling the familiar thrill of flight. But today was different. Today, she was heading toward an active combat zone where people were shooting at each other with deadly intent. "Navy 201 flight, contact strike," Martinez called over the radio, switching to the frequency that would control their combat air patrol mission. "Navy 201 flight, strike. We have you loud and clear." Proceed to Cap Station Alpha and establish orbit at flight level 200. Be advised, hostile air activity reported in your vicinity. Sarah acknowledged the transmission while scanning her radar display for contacts. The combat air patrol would position them between the threatened convoy and any hostile aircraft attempting to attack the ships. Her role was to detect, identify, and if necessary engage any threats before they could reach their targets. The next hour passed in a state of heightened alertness as Sarah and Martinez maintained their patrol pattern. Several contacts appeared on their radar screens, but all were eventually identified as friendly aircraft or civilian airliners following established air routes. "This is Razor." Martinez's voice came through her headset. "I'm showing a contact bearing 045, range 60 miles, altitude unknown. Appears to be heading toward the convoy." Sarah immediately turned her attention to the indicated bearing, using her radar to confirm the contact. The unknown aircraft was indeed approaching the area of the merchant ships, and its flight profile suggested hostile intent. "Navy 201 flight, you are cleared to investigate unknown contact," came the authorization from the strike controller aboard the carrier. "Rules of engagement are in effect." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as they turned toward the intercept. This could be her first actual air-to-air engagement, the ultimate test of her skills and training. Every simulation, every practice mission had been preparation for this moment. "Contact is now 40 miles and closing," Martinez reported. "Appears to be a single aircraft, medium size, no transponder response." As they closed the distance to the unknown contact, Sarah could see it clearly on her radar display. The aircraft was maneuvering erratically and appeared to be armed with external stores. More concerning, it was directly approaching the convoy and ignoring radio calls for identification. "Navy 201 flight, unknown aircraft, you are approaching restricted airspace and are directed to turn away immediately." Martinez transmitted on the international emergency frequency. There was no response from the unknown aircraft, which continued its approach toward the convoy. Sarah could now see the aircraft visually. A sleek fighter-type aircraft with weapons pylons loaded with what appeared to be anti-ship missiles. "Navy 201 flight, you are authorized to engage if the hostile aircraft enters the convoy's defensive perimeter," came the instruction from strike control. Sarah armed her weapons systems and prepared for combat. The unknown aircraft was now only 20 miles from the convoy and showed no signs of turning away. Her finger moved to the trigger on her control stick as she waited for Martinez's command to engage. "Hostile aircraft, this is your final warning," Martinez transmitted. "Turn away immediately, or you will be fired upon." The hostile aircraft suddenly turned directly toward the convoy and began descending, clearly positioning for an attack run on the merchant ships. Sarah could see the missiles on its wing pylons and knew that if it got much closer, innocent sailors would die. "Fox 3. Martinez called, indicating the launch of an AMRAAM missile. Sarah watched the missile streak toward its target, covering the intervening distance in seconds. The hostile aircraft attempted evasive maneuvers, but the advanced guidance system of the UMRA proved too accurate to evade. The missile detonated near the hostile aircraft's engine compartment, causing immediate and catastrophic damage. "Splash 1, Martinez reported as the hostile aircraft fell toward the sea in pieces, threat neutralized. Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions as she watched the destruction of the enemy aircraft. This had been her first combat engagement, albeit as a wingman rather than the shooter. The technical execution had been flawless, but the reality of taking a life in combat was sobering. "Good work, Navy 201 flight," came the congratulations from strike control. "Return to Cap Station and resume patrol." The remainder of their mission passed without further incident, but the successful engagement had clearly demonstrated the squadron's readiness for combat operations. When they returned to the carrier several hours later, Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction at having proven herself under fire. "How do you feel about your first combat mission?" Martinez asked during their post-flight debrief. "Focused and professional," Sarah replied. "I'm glad we were able to protect the convoy without any losses." "You handled yourself well up there," Martinez said. "Your situational awareness was excellent, and you were ready to engage when the situation required it." Rebecca Torres would have been proud. Admiral Hayes joined them for the formal debrief. asking detailed questions about the engagement and the hostile aircraft's tactics. His assessment was overwhelmingly positive, praising both pilots for their professional execution of a challenging mission. "This deployment is off to an excellent start," Hayes concluded. "The hostile forces in this region now know that we're here and that we're prepared to defend innocent shipping. That should give them pause before attempting further attacks." That evening, Sarah stood on the flight deck watching the sunset paint the Mediterranean sky in brilliant colors. The successful combat mission had marked another milestone in her journey from Air Force pilot to Navy aviator, but more importantly, it had validated her ability to carry the Venom Viper call sign with honor. The deployment would continue for several more weeks, with additional combat missions and constant training to maintain readiness. Each day brought new challenges and opportunities to prove herself worthy of the legacy she had inherited. Lieutenant Commander Torch Williams approached as Sarah watched the last light fade from the western horizon. "I heard about your mission today," she said. "First combat engagement is always memorable. It felt good to know that our training paid off when it mattered," Sarah replied. "Martinez did an excellent job leading the flight." "I'm sure he did. But from what I heard, you were right there with him every step of the way. That's what counts in this business, being ready when your number comes up." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah reflected on the events of the day and the journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months ago, she had been an Air Force pilot stationed in Nevada, flying routine training missions and wondering about her future. Today, she was a combat-tested Navy aviator serving aboard one of the world's most powerful warships. The transformation had been challenging, requiring her to learn new skills, adapt to different procedures, and prove herself to a skeptical community of seasoned professionals. But the most significant change had been internal, the development of confidence that she could measure up to the standards set by pilots like Rebecca Torres. The Venom Viper call sign no longer felt like an impossible burden to bear. Through her actions in training and combat, Sarah had begun to make it her own while honoring the memory of the pilot who had first carried the name. The legacy would continue, carried forward by someone worthy of its history and committed to maintaining its honor. 3 weeks later, as the USS Gerald R. Ford headed home after a successful deployment, Admiral Hayes summoned Sarah to his cabin for a final evaluation. The compartment was small but comfortable, decorated with photographs and mementos from a distinguished career. "Sit down, Lieutenant Commander," Hayes said, gesturing toward a chair across from his desk. "I wanted to speak with you before we reach port." Sarah took the offered seat, wondering what final assessment the Admiral would provide of her performance during the deployment. "This deployment has been a revelation," Hayes began. "When you first arrived at the squadron and chose the Venom Viper call sign, I wasn't sure what to expect. It seemed like an impossible coincidence, almost too convenient to be believable. I understand your skepticism, sir, but over the past month you've proven that there was nothing coincidental about it. You've demonstrated the same qualities that made Rebecca Torres exceptional: skill, courage, professionalism, and an absolute commitment to the mission." Hayes opened his desk drawer and pulled out an official-looking document. "Your fitness report for this deployment period is the highest I've written in 5 years. You've not only met the standards expected of a naval aviator, you've exceeded them." Sarah felt a surge of pride and satisfaction at the Admiral's words. "Thank you, sir. This squadron has given me the opportunity to prove myself, and I've tried to make the most of it." "You've done more than that," Hayes continued. "You've honored the memory of a fallen warrior while establishing your own reputation as an exceptional pilot. The Venom Viper call sign is in good hands." As Sarah left the Admiral's cabin and made her way back to her stateroom, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment and belonging. The journey from Air Force pilot to Navy aviator was complete, but her career in naval aviation was just beginning. Rebecca Torres's notebook remained on her desk, its pages now supplemented with Sarah's own observations and lessons learned from her first combat deployment. A legacy would continue, passed down from one generation of naval aviators to the next, each pilot adding their own chapter to the story. The USS Gerald R. Ford cut through the Atlantic swells toward home, carrying its crew and air wing back to families and friends who had waited anxiously for their return. For Sarah, home was now wherever her squadron was based, among the men and women who had accepted her as one of their own. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Venom Viper Mitchell, naval aviator, had found her place in the world.